Long before slave ships ever crossed the Atlantic, slavery had already left deep scars on other civilizations. And this part of history, the one you were never taught in school, holds the key to understanding why the world is the way it is today. While you were made to believe it all started with the Americas, the truth is that human domination began millennia earlier, in the shadows of Sumerian temples, in the courts of ancient Egypt, and in the wars that determined the fate of entire peoples. Today, you're going to uncover when and where human slavery truly began. You'll learn about the first enslaved peoples, the earliest empires that turned human beings into property, and the real reason this history has been so carefully buried. We're not talking about theories, we're talking about facts. Facts that were silenced, edited, erased, because exposing this truth threatens those who always wanted to appear civilized. If you think you've already seen everything about slavery, get ready to have your beliefs shattered. Because what we're about to reveal here could change the way you see history, the world, and even yourself. Take a deep breath. What you're about to hear, no one has ever told you. For a long time, people were taught that slavery began when slave ships arrived in the Americas. That image of shackles in Brazil, of cotton fields in the United States, of sugar mills in the Caribbean, is often seen as the starting point. But the truth is, that was just the most recent chapter in a much older story. Slavery, as an organized system, had already existed for thousands of years. To reduce it all to the Atlantic slave trade is to erase centuries of pain and domination that shaped countless civilizations. It's strange how common knowledge gets stuck in the last 500 years, as if suffering had a clock. Open any school textbook and you'll see a distorted slice of history. Western narratives tend to center pain only when it crossed the Atlantic, but remain silent on the horrors that took place in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, or during Asia's imperial wars. That's no accident. That's strategy. Slavery is not an American phenomenon. It is a global, ancient scar. Understanding this changes everything. Because when we realize slavery existed long before Portugal, Spain, or colonialism, we begin to see how deep the roots really go. This isn't just about racism. It's about a system that used wars, religion, caste, and law to turn people into property. Dehumanization began long before gunpowder, and it's this hidden past that we must dig up with courage. Think about it, even period films reinforce the illusion. Hollywood often shows enslaved people only in the cotton fields of the American South, but rarely takes us to Sumer, where ancient laws already placed price tags on human beings. And almost never do we see how ancient Egypt relied on servitude for its monumental projects. It's as if the global history of slavery had been compressed into a single century, conveniently edited. Maybe that's why so many people still don't grasp the true weight of slavery in human history. When people believe it all began with the Americas, they overlook the fact that entire civilizations once thrived on the exploitation of conquered peoples, captured women, and children sold like livestock. Before the whips of the colonies, there were much older chains, and they lead us directly to the next part of this revealing journey. Long before European colonization, when the world still walked in straw sandals and lived by torchlight, slavery was already an established reality. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of some of the oldest civilizations in history, clay tablets already mentioned human ownership as part of the social order. It wasn't the exception, it was the rule. To enslave was as institutionalized as collecting taxes or measuring land. Human beings were already seen as tradable goods. Take Sumer, for instance. Known as one of the world's first urban societies, it built not just temples, but hierarchies that allowed people to become currency. Slavery there could result from unpaid debts, legal punishment, or simply war. And this pattern spread. Freedom was always conditional, granted or taken away depending on what those in power decided. And what about ancient Egypt? Ah, the land of majestic pyramids, animal-headed gods and golden tombs. What people rarely discuss is that part of this greatness was built on forced labor. Workers, war prisoners, and even debtors were required to serve the state for years or for life. And we're not talking mythology. We're talking real historical records, found in inscriptions, papyri, and tombs that tell an uncomfortable truth. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's first written legal systems, made it very clear. There were specific punishments for enslaved people. That proves the system wasn't random. It was structured, recognized, and even normalized. It was as if the law said, "This is how we treat those who are no longer citizens, but property." Anyone reading that code carefully will realize that slavery back then was as common as farming, and no one seemed to question it. Based on these legal and social foundations, we begin to understand that slavery didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was cultivated, legitimized, and systematized. And this structure would become the blueprint for other civilizations to come, even those still glorified in history books for their wisdom and spirituality. It's time to widen our lens beyond pyramids and ziggurats and see the invisible chains that already bound thousands of lives in silence across the first cities. Egypt, known by many as the cradle of wisdom and monumental architecture, was also home to sophisticated systems of slavery. Forced labor there wasn't just physical, it was spiritualized. The enslaved could be considered offerings to the gods or instruments of the pharaoh. War prisoners, debt slaves, and even children born into slavery were forced into building Pharaoh's grand monuments. And over time, this became normalized, part of the empire's very structure. In India, the caste system played a brutal role in maintaining inequality. The idea that some people were born impure gave legitimacy to a hereditary form of servitude that was nearly impossible to escape. The so-called untouchables carried the weight of centuries of exclusion, symbolic violence, and physical exploitation. Imagine being born condemned to clean the waste of others, with no chance to rewrite your destiny. It was slavery, veiled under the cloak of religion and culture. In ancient China, slavery wore different masks, but the essence was the same: domination. During the Zhou, Qin, and Han dynasties, people could be enslaved due to debt, crimes, or simply for being born into the wrong lineage. Many were used as domestic servants, agricultural laborers, or even court musicians. It was common for families to sell their daughters as maids to survive economic hardship. And who were the buyers? Nobles, emperors, and powerful merchants. These civilizations, considered pillars of Eastern knowledge, proved that wisdom can walk hand in hand with oppression. Slavery wasn't a sign of ignorance. It was a sign of structure. A structure that used religious doctrines, social codes, and entire systems to justify the domination of some over others. So when people say, "That's just how it was back then," it's important to remember, just because something was common doesn't mean it was ever just not then, and certainly not now. Perhaps the most disturbing part is realizing how much of those ancient structures still echo in how we treat people today. Debt bondage, hereditary inequality, invisible labor. None of that is as far removed as we'd like to believe. Yes, those civilizations left grand legacies, but they also left deep scars of dehumanization. And it's this connection between war and slavery that we're going to explore next. War has always been one of the cruelest pathways for slavery to spread. In ancient times, victory wasn't just measured by territory gained, it was also about how many bodies were captured. Entire populations were taken as property, nameless, rightless, choiceless. They were considered spoils of war, living trophies. And in this way, violence became a form of social contract. The Roman Empire may be the most extreme example. It's estimated that millions of enslaved people passed through Roman hands, from Gaul to Palestine, North Africa, to the outer edges of Germania. Many of these prisoners were sent to mines, worked vast agricultural fields, or died in the bloody arenas of the Colosseum. Gladiators like Spartacus weren't heroes by choice. They were enslaved men, forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of others. And the women? Oh, the women captured in war suffered a double torment. Not only were they stripped of freedom, many were turned into concubines, servants, or simply handed out as gifts to commanders. The female body was treated like territory. If it could be conquered, it could be used. This brutal logic endured for centuries and still lingers in language and behavior that dehumanizes women today. Slavery born of war spared no one. It's deeply ironic that civilizations known for exalting philosophy, architecture, and rhetoric could so easily justify slavery. The same people who wrote treatises on ethics and justice also wrote laws on how to buy, sell, and punish human beings. It was as if reason had been shielded from empathy. The mind evolved, but the heart didn't always follow. And it's exactly this coldness that explains how slavery spread so far, for so long, without resistance. When winning a war meant profiting from people, the incentive was built in. And this logic wasn't limited to Europe or the Middle East. It extended into pre-colonial Africa, where internal conflicts created their own systems of domination. Now let's look at a continent that was far more than a victim. It was also a player in a game that would change scale with the arrival of Europeans. Before European colonizers ever set foot there, the African continent had its own power dynamics, trade systems, and internal conflicts. Kingdoms like Benin, the Mali Empire, and the Congo had well-organized societies with caste systems, armies, and economies. Yes, internal slavery existed, but not in the industrial, dehumanizing way the Atlantic slave trade would later bring. It was a more localized system, with different purposes: debt bondage, punishment, or the result of tribal warfare. Still, it was domination. It was exploitation. Some of these practices overlapped with political alliances and inter-kingdom agreements. A victorious king might offer enslaved people as diplomatic currency, or trade them for horses, salt, or fabric. In some regions, enslaved individuals could eventually integrate into the community, marry, own land, or even rise socially, something unthinkable in the later European colonial system. That doesn't justify the practice, but it shows how different the structures were. Slavery in pre-colonial Africa had a face, a name, and possibilities, before it was turned into pure profit. It's important to remember, Africa was not a wild land waiting to be colonized. It was a vibrant, complex continent filled with contradictions, strengths, and violence. And within those contradictions, rival tribes waged war against each other, sold captured enemies, and in doing so, created the very channels that would later be exploited by Portugal and Spain. When the Europeans arrived with weapons and greed, they found systems already in place and corrupted them with promises of easy profit. To deny that internal slavery existed in Africa is to fall into the opposite extreme of historical distortion. But it's also dangerous to equate that local practice with the transatlantic industry that followed. The difference lies in the scale, the brutality, and the systematic dehumanization imposed by the colonizers. What was once the exception became the rule. What was once local became global, and what had limits turned into a machine powered by blood and silence. And it's right here that history takes a terrifying turn. Because with the arrival of the Europeans, slavery stopped being a local survival system and became the engine of one of the most profitable industries of the ancient world. Portugal and Spain didn't just come to explore, they came to industrialize suffering. And it's this brutal turning point that we need to talk about now. When Europeans set foot on African soil, they brought more than crosses, cannons and mirrors. They brought a new model of slavery, far more cruel, far more organized, far more profitable. Portugal was one of the first to establish trading posts along the African coast, exchanging muskets for people. Spain quickly followed, and what had once been a regional practice turned into the driving gear of a system that would cross oceans. Slavery now had spreadsheets, shipping routes, and ledgers. This brutal system began to operate like a multinational industry of horror. Entire communities were kidnapped, branded, sold, and packed into slave ships bound for the mines and plantations of the Americas. Men were chained, women violated, children torn from their families. There was no room for humanity. It was as if their souls were extracted even before their bodies boarded the ships. The logic was simple. The more slaves, the more production. The more production, the more profit. This machine turned suffering into capital, and the Atlantic became a silent graveyard of drowned dreams. It's estimated that over 12 million Africans were forcibly taken, and that's just what was documented. The real number may be even darker. It was the trafficking of human flesh, stamped with a European seal. Over time, this industry reshaped entire continents: Latin America, the Caribbean, the United States. All of these regions were redrawn by this cruel force called slavery. Cities rose on sweat and bones, fortunes were built on pain, and meanwhile in Europe, colonizers beat their chests in the name of civilization, while counting human lives like sacks of grain. It was dehumanization at an industrial scale. And perhaps the most perverse part of all this is realizing how little of this history is actually told. Not with all its details, not with all its horrors. Why? Who benefited from that silence? Who decided that the suffering of millions should be reduced to 2 pages in a school textbook? That's the erasure, the historical silencing we need to confront now. Have you ever wondered why we learn so little about slavery before the Americas? In school, history often begins in the 15th century with the slave ships. What came before? Sumer, Egypt, imperial wars, internal African slavery is almost never mentioned. It's as if there were an invisible line censoring the deeper past. But that line has an author. The interests of those who wrote the official version of history. Western narratives created a kind of selective filter. They show what's convenient and erase what threatens their image. Talking about slavery as a global ancient phenomenon challenges the narrative of European superiority. It exposes contradictions, shatters myths, reveals hypocrisies. That's why silence became a tool to protect old privileges, ones that still echo today. Once we understand that silence is also a form of domination, everything starts to make sense. Whoever controls the story controls the memory, and whoever controls the memory controls the future. By hiding the foundations of slavery in ancient civilizations, the illusion of European civility is maintained, an illusion that simply isn't real. It's a thick layer of makeup over centuries of systemic horror. This silencing also reinforces dehumanization, because if the pain of millions isn't told, it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, no one has to take responsibility, reflect, or repair. It's erasure as political strategy. As the Chinese writer Yu Hua once said, "When the past is forgotten, it repeats itself as tragedy." And until we retell this history correctly, the cycle continues. But what if we could break that cycle? What if, by rescuing the truth, we also rescued the dignity and identity of so many erased peoples? That's what we're going to explore now. How historical restoration doesn't just change books, it changes how we see ourselves. When we realize that slavery didn't begin with the Americas, but long before, something shifts inside us. It's not just about ancient history, it's about identity, belonging, and awareness. It's like uncovering a missing piece of a puzzle that was hidden on purpose. Knowing this makes us stop accepting the obvious and start questioning it. And questioning is the first step in rebuilding what was denied to us. This truth reconfigures how we see our place in the world. Those descended from enslaved peoples carry more than pain. They carry resistance, wisdom, ancestral memory. This is not just about trauma, it's about power. About recognizing that despite millennia of domination, these peoples created culture, spirituality, music, art, and science. And that must be recognized, valued, and taught. And even those who aren't direct descendants of slavery must ask, what role am I playing in this structure? What I consume, support, or share? Does it reinforce these erasures or dismantle them? Change starts with knowledge, but it only gains strength through action. Supporting Black authors, studying the global history of slavery, having tough conversations at home, calling out racist comments, these are small steps, but powerful ones. When you share this kind of knowledge, you're not just passing on facts, you're restoring dignity. You're saying, I see you, I see your story. You're doing what textbooks refuse to do for centuries. It's a quiet yet transformative form of reparation, because those who shine light into darkness help others see where there was once only shadow. And if all of this moved you, wait until you see what comes next. Because now, at the end of this journey, it's time to look forward, to figure out how to turn this impact into action, and to understand that real history doesn't end in books. It begins in every choice you make from now on. Today, you learned something few have the courage to say out loud. Slavery didn't begin with the caravels. It began with humanity itself. Long before the whips of the colonies, there were chains in the world's oldest civilizations. And understanding that changes everything. It changes how we see history, how we understand the present, and how we shape the future, because the truth may have been silenced, but not forever. The question now is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let it die here like just another curiosity? Or will you become part of the rewriting of this story? You can share this video with someone who still thinks slavery is a thing of the past. You can spark uncomfortable conversations. You can give voice to those who were always silenced. Think with me, how many stories were erased? How many voices were silenced for convenience? We can't change the past, but we can stop it from being told in half-truths. And that starts with simple actions. Learn more, support content like this, pass it on, give visibility to those made invisible. The truth sets us free, but only if it's shared. If this journey moved you, outraged you, or made you reflect, then it already fulfilled its purpose. And if you've made it this far, you're part of a rare group. The ones who want to know, even when it hurts. The ones who prefer uncomfortable truths over convenient lies. And it's with you that we want to walk from here on out. So if you believe history deserves to be told with courage, subscribe now to the channel. Hit the bell so you don't miss new videos like this, always bringing truths school never told you. And share this with someone who needs to see beyond what they were always told. Let's retell the story, the way it really happened.